How do you prepare to negotiate effectively with a really tough bargainer? In this case, with Vladimir Putin on the war in Ukraine. I'm Jim Sebenius, professor at Harvard Business School, director of the Harvard Negotiation Project at Harvard Law School, and co-director of the American Secretaries of State Project with my two friends and colleagues, Bob Mnookin, professor at Harvard Law School, and Nick Burns, longtime diplomat, professor at Harvard's Kennedy School, and currently the U.S. ambassador to the People's Republic of China. I should quickly note that as a function of Nick's official role in China, he did not participate in the creation of this particular program, nor should it be taken to represent the views of the United States government. As a direct result of the American Secretaries of State Program, I believe that we can offer some uniquely valuable perspectives into negotiating effectively with Vladimir Putin. This consists of the experiences of 5 former U.S. Secretaries of State, each of whom we extensively interviewed, and each of whom offered their advice for dealing with this challenging Russian leader. First, however, a bit more on the American Secretaries of State Program. It's a joint effort among the Future of Diplomacy Project at the Harvard Kennedy School, the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School, and my home institution, Harvard Business School. We conducted many hours of videotaped interviews with each of the former U.S. Secretaries of State, mostly at Harvard. We interviewed Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, James Baker, Madeleine Albright, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, and Rex Tillerson. Our interviews, both in private and before large audiences, focused on the toughest negotiations each of them carried out in their roles as Secretary of State. We consistently discussed their negotiations with the Soviet Union and Russia, in Asia, especially with China, in the Middle East, and elsewhere. We drilled down to understand what they did, why, what they might have done differently, and what they took as lessons from these encounters. From background research and from these unique interviews, we create teaching materials, case studies, articles, and books. In fact, I've been creating a forthcoming podcast series entitled Dealcraft, Insights from Great Negotiators, that draws on these interviews as well as on other conversations with remarkable business, financial, entrepreneurial, and legal negotiators. As one part of these wide-ranging interviews, we consistently asked each secretary who'd negotiated directly with Vladimir Putin about his or her experiences and lessons they would take from the process. I want to make clear what this program is about and what it's not about. When I teach or advise clients on challenging and complex negotiations, I normally focus on 3 sets of interrelated moves that make reaching your target deal most likely. With my co-author David Lax, we've developed these quite systematically into an approach we call 3D negotiation. The 3 dimensions we discuss are setup, deal design, and tactics. First, setup. These are the crucial actions that you take away from the table to ensure that you have the most promising possible situation once you're actually at the negotiation table to deal directly with your counterpart. In the Ukraine context, these consists of aid, military and economic, to Ukraine, bulking up and revitalizing NATO, imposing sanctions on Russia, as well as recruiting allies for these efforts. Now, many people, and I, certainly have plenty of ideas on the right setup for these negotiations, but that is not the focus of this program. Second, deal design. This is the art and science of crafting agreements that unlock value and are most likely to induce a yes from the other side. In the case of Ukraine, these elements could involve a ceasefire, withdrawal of Russian forces, the relationship of Ukraine to the European Union and NATO, the status of Donbas and perhaps Crimea, sanctions relief, the role of the International Criminal Court, and so on. There are many creative ideas for deal design, but that's not our subject either. Our third dimension is tactics, which frankly is the preoccupation of most negotiation analysts. Beyond the right setup and beyond a promising deal design, tactics are the interpersonal and psychological moves you make when directly dealing with your counterpart, in this case, Vladimir Putin. Now, there's some excellent books on Vladimir Putin, and I commend them to anyone who expects to negotiate with him. For understanding the man, I've found books by Masha Gessen, Fiona Hill, Catherine Belton, Timothy Snyder, Mike McFall, Ann Applebaum, and Gary Kasparov, all useful among many others. But beyond what you can learn from books and memos about negotiating with Vladimir Putin, an essential part of preparation is querying the experiences and insights of people who've directly and extensively negotiated with him. That's what we'll be offering in a few moments. And we'll look to the experiences of Colin Powell, of Condoleezza Rice, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, and Rex Tillerson. While the advice we'll be sharing certainly should be valuable to Americans who may negotiate with Vladimir Putin, many other officials and diplomats are likely to do so as well, and we hope they'll benefit. At present, I'm thinking of Chinese, Turkish, Israeli, and Finnish diplomats and officials, and undoubtedly there will be others as well. Yet, there should be a nagging question behind what we're about to present. And for that, I turn to my friend and colleague, Bob Mnookin. Bob?
I'm Bob Mnookin, and I'm the Williston Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and the former chair of the program on negotiation. Together with my friends Jim Sebenius and Nick Burns, I've been a co-director of our American Secretaries of State project. There's a prior question that needs to be addressed, and that is, should one be negotiating with Putin? I've written a book relevant to this question. It's called Bargaining with the Devil: When to Negotiate, When to Fight. By bargaining, I mean working to resolve the conflict through interacting directly with Putin. And by devil, what do I mean? I don't literally believe in devils, but what I mean by a devil is someone who has hurt you in the past, someone you don't trust, and someone you may even think is evil. By my definition, I think it's clear that Putin qualifies as a devil. He has shown himself willing to lie. He has, in fact, been prepared to break all kinds of promises and prior agreements. And he's engaged in evil acts. That is the deliberate infliction of serious harm on other human beings without adequate justification. So should you bargain with the devil? The answer my book gives is not always, but more often than you feel like it. The challenge is making wise decisions about whether to negotiate. There are no categorical answers, yes or no, and the answer is always very context specific. There are two reasons that you often won't feel like negotiating with the devil. First, there are a number of negative traps and strong emotions that may make you want to fight when clear-headed analysis would demonstrate that you should negotiate. The second reason relates to morality and legitimacy. Any deal you make with an evil adversary will also benefit your adversary. This may violate moral principles. My book offers a disciplined way of thinking about how to answer the question of whether you should negotiate or not. My framework explicitly evaluates the potential costs and benefits of alternative courses of action. Assessing these potential costs and benefits is not easy. They involve predicting your adversary's reactions and future behavior. In addition, of course, there are these considerations of legitimacy and morality. The core task is to try to assess whether there's a potential deal that could better serve your core interests and also serve Putin's core interests. Additionally, one, of course, must be concerned with whether such a deal, even if made, could be implemented. Let's assume that you've decided that it makes sense for you to negotiate with Putin. Let's now examine how these secretaries of state approached this task.
A good place to start is with the experiences of Colin Powell. Of course, he had a distinguished 40-plus year military career, rising to the rank of 4-star general, serving as national security advisor. At the time, the Pentagon was developing the, quote, Strategic Defense Initiative, unquote, SDI, as Powell will refer to it, sometimes colloquially called Star Wars. But SDI was constrained by the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which Powell will refer to as the ABM Treaty. President Bush decides to withdraw from the ABM Treaty. The U.S. allies and the Russians are strongly opposed to this. And I would just note that in the audience of students, faculty, distinguished guests, was former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, to whom Powell briefly addresses his remarks.
Let me start with the fact that I know Mr. Putin quite well. I've negotiated with him, I've argued with him, and he's a fascinating guy. And he's KGB through and through, like most of the Soviet generals and admirals and KGB types that I've worked with in the course of my career. But one quick story, just to give you a sense of my relationship with Putin and what I think about him. One of the things the administration wanted to do immediately upon taking office was to abrogate our responsibilities under the ABM Treaty, because we wanted to continue pushing our SDI work ahead. And I said to President Bush, let's take some time. This is a big one. Our allies are against us abrogating. Russians are going nuts. And we don't have to do it right away. The Pentagon doesn't need relief yet. So give me time to just see if it's possible to do SDI within the ABM Treaty. And he said, okay. Others didn't like it, but he allowed me to do that. So Igor Ivanov, the foreign minister, and I, we negotiated for 9 months, both of us knowing you couldn't do it. The ABM Treaty won't allow you to do SDI. But we negotiated. We had a good time. We drank vodka and we negotiated and had a great time. And I got to know him very well, and I got to know the others very well. And then finally it reached a point when Pentagon said, we're hitting the limit. We're about to violate this treaty in a few months. You got to abrogate. Okay. Went to the president, told him, Mr. President, it's time to make notice of our abrogation. And he said, fine, you go tell Putin. And while you're at it, go to France, Paris, and London and tell all of them, all in one day. Okay, whatever. So I started with Putin. I went into the Kremlin. He knew what I was coming for. Igor was there, and my ambassador was there. We sat in Putin's small office, and he sat there with those blue eyes, eating me, cutting me up. And I said, Mr. President, I'm here to tell you that we've given this a great deal of thought. Igor and I have worked on this for 9 months. Oh, God, didn't we, Igor? And we can't find a solution. So I'm here to tell you that tomorrow or the next day, the president will make a public announcement that we're giving you 6 months notice of our abrogation of our responsibilities under the ABM Treaty. You don't know how terrible this is. General, Mr. Secretary, this is undercutting the entire basis of strategic stability in the world. I can't believe you're doing this. And you know what your allies are going to say. You know what all your NATO friends are going to say. They're all going to hate you for this. Remember, Anders? And you can't do this. And I said, Mr. President, I understand your objections. I will pass them on to the president. But nevertheless, this is what we're going to be doing 2 days from now.
Let me pause for a moment and ask the question why Powell spent 9 months in a negotiation that he and his counterpart mutually acknowledged was pointless. They weren't going to come to an agreement. None was possible. And yet, you can see what Powell was doing. He was getting to know Putin's inner circle. They were also clearly demonstrating to other audiences, especially allies in the American public, that they weren't rushing into a withdrawal from the ABM Treaty, but were deliberately going through a negotiating process. There are lots of reasons for negotiating other than trying to reach a deal. But let's continue with Powell.
He suddenly almost melted and said, good, we won't have to talk about this anymore. And they said, you and Igor go off and find a new treaty. Yes, sir. 6 months later, we were back in Moscow signing a treaty reducing nuclear weapons by a third. Treaty of Moscow, which went through the Senate unanimously. Could be done. And so he's that kind of guy who could turn on a dime if he has to. But what he is now is a pure nationalist who was doing something that the Russian people thought they badly needed. And that's restoring a sense of pride, and we are somebody.
That's potentially some pretty useful insight. Not only do you get a sense of what Putin is like interpersonally, but the sense, at least at that time in the U.S.-Russian relationship, he was quite willing to be adaptable if circumstances warranted. He could, as Powell put it, turn on a dime, unquote. Although turning on a dime was accompanied by an effort to do a new treaty that would make him look good. Let's turn to Condoleezza Rice, who was Secretary of State in the second term of the George W. Bush administration. She followed Powell and had been in government in the National Security Council. She had played a number of roles in earlier administrations. But it's important to realize that she was and is a distinguished academic. And that gave her a special standing with Vladimir Putin, a point of connection, in the same way that Powell forged something of a connection given his intelligence and military experience. This interview was conducted at Stanford. Bob Mnookin, Nick Burns, and I are interviewing Secretary Rice, and I ask the question that I asked of virtually all the secretaries. You've had a lot of experience dealing with Soviet affairs and later Russian affairs, and you've dealt with Vladimir Putin quite a lot. And I'm very curious about your assessment of him as a negotiator, and if you were giving advice to someone who was going to negotiate with him to be effective, what would you suggest both interpersonally and the kinds of moves that you need to make to set up the most promising possible situation with this challenging Russian leader?
Well, I did spend a lot of time with Vladimir Putin, and at some level I think he liked me because I'm a Russianist. And from time to time he would say, "Condi, you know us." And at that moment I would think, oh, here it comes, something odd is about to be said here. But I think he respected the fact that I had been a student of the Soviet Union and then Russia. And that is where I would start. He has to respect the person with whom he's negotiating. He's a tough guy. He grew up in the KGB culture. He made his way through the Yeltsin period by pushing aside his adversaries. And he respects toughness, he respects directness. I never found in negotiating with him that he was surprised when I made a strong advocacy of an American position. So I think the most important thing with Vladimir Putin is to be straightforward and tough and to stick to your guns. It's also very important to be willing and ready to challenge him on the facts, because we always found that he had these odd facts, and I suspected that he'd actually been told these things. He told President Bush once, well, you have two kinds of chickens. We were talking about the dispute over chicken parts going into Russia as a trade matter. And he said, you have two kinds of chickens. You have sick chickens that you send abroad, and then you've got good chickens that you sell in the United States. And President Bush said, who told you that? You know, there was once that he told us, well, you get most of your oil from Iraq, which of course we don't. And so I often wondered, is it just that he isn't given good facts, because he's very smart. It's not that he lacks intellect at any level. So first of all, be tough and direct, and secondly, be ready to confront some erroneous facts. Well, I've always said that credibility isn't divisible. And so if the United States has established a reputation for toughness in general, that helps in negotiating with somebody like Putin. As much as he didn't like, for instance, our decision to withdraw from the ABM treaty, he accepted it, he moved on, because we were clear and straightforward about it. But there are also, and I think this is true whoever you're negotiating with, there's some things you need to do before you go into the room to negotiate. First of all, I always found it helpful to spend some time both with our ambassador, whether it was Bill Burns or Sandy Vershbow or whomever, because we had good ambassadors in Moscow. And they always knew the ground. They had talked with their counterparts. Preparation is not just reading memos that are prepared for you. It's talking with people who actually know what's going on the ground. The other thing is that I had a very good relationship with Sergei Ivanov, who at one time was the National Security Advisor head, at another time was Minister of Defense when I was in government, and is now Putin's Chief of Staff. They were very close personally. They had also come out of the KGB together. And I always made time to talk with Sergei first. What's on his mind? What is he going to want to talk about? And then I could go to President Bush and say, here's what I think the agenda is going to be, and we didn't waste time.
I want to underscore Rice's advice on talking to people on the ground who know the actual situation, in addition to the kind of preparation you get from reading memos and books and articles and so forth. In Rice's case, Sergei Ivanov turned out to be a useful source of information. If you add together the advice we would get from Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, you get a fuller picture of what it's like to negotiate with Vladimir Putin. We next get advice from someone whom Vladimir Putin deeply disliked and tried to undermine during her run for president. Hillary Clinton was the object of all kinds of Russian machinations in the 2016 elections. We interviewed her several months after Donald Trump's inauguration, and the challenge for her as Secretary of State was, how do you negotiate with somebody who really doesn't like you, and yet you've got important business to do? There were budding nuclear issues. There was the need for an air corridor over Russia to resupply U.S. troops in Afghanistan, a corridor that did not go over Pakistan, which was often problematic. And she sought Russia's cooperation in sanctions against Iran and help with the Iran nuclear deal. So it was important for her to deal with Vladimir Putin. Let's turn to Secretary Clinton.
To deal with somebody like Putin, you have to be very clear about what you're trying to achieve, even if you know you're not going to get it at the first, the second, the third, the 10th, or the 20th negotiation. But you also have to keep looking for some way to get insights into him and how he thinks and operates and what he would be positive about. And I had gone to the Leningrad, the St. Petersburg memorial the last time I'd been there.
And he's from there.
And he's from there.
Yeah.
And it was the first time I'd gone there. And it is overpowering. And so I'm sitting at dinner, and, he's sitting there. And I said to him, Mr. President, I went to the memorial, and all of a sudden, he pays attention. And he asked me what I thought, and I told him, and what I had seen there. And then out of the blue, he says, I will tell you a story. And he tells me this story that I think explains a lot of his psyche. He tells me this story. It happened before he was born. His father is on the front lines fending off the Nazis. And every so often they would get a break to be able to go home after days of fighting. His father was taking one of those breaks. He was going home to their apartment. He's passing a big pile of bodies that are stacked in the street. He's walking by now. The corner of his eye, he sees a leg with a shoe on. He goes, that's my wife. And he goes up to the body collector, says, that's my wife, that's my wife. And he runs over and he takes the leg and he's trying to pull her out of the body pile. And the grave diggers are saying, get out of here, we have to get these bodies off the street. And Putin's father won't let go of what he thinks of as his wife's leg. And finally, they just say, okay, fine, you can have your dead wife. And he pulls this woman out. It is his wife, and she is alive. Wow. I mean, there had been bombing and strafing, and people had fallen in the streets, but they just collected everybody. So Putin's father takes his wife into their apartment and nurses her back to health. And after the war, a few years later, Putin is born. Now think about that story. Now we finish the dinner, and I go back to my room, and I get every Russian expert I've got, Mike McFaul and everybody's there. And I said, have you ever heard this story about Putin? Nobody ever heard it. I put it in my book. They don't say a word about it, which suggests to me that it's true, or at least Putin thinks it's true. So it's in the book. And I said to, the team there that night, I said, think about what shaped somebody who's told that story from the moment he can understand. You would not have been here if your father had not rescued your mother from a pile of bodies while the Russians were heroically defending this city and country from the Germans. Never forget that. And so you do have to try to find some way to unpack the experience, the mind of somebody sitting across the table. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that from psychological and political and historic, cultural backgrounds of what makes people tick. So I think with Putin, you have to try to develop something of a personal relationship. And even though, he and his considerable team sided with my opponent and helped to defeat me, I think that's true anyway. And he does not respect weakness, and he does not respect people who give in too easily, and he does not respect someone who doesn't respect him. So you can respect him and deeply disagree with him and try to outmaneuver him, outnegotiate him, prevent him from doing damage to our democracy, damage to Western Europe, damage everywhere he goes. But you have to have a strategy, and you have to have a long-term vision of where it is you think this relationship could go. So when you draw a line, you draw a line. If you can give them a little so that you gain something later, that's part of the strategy. So I had thought a lot about what I would do with him if I were able to negotiate with him again. And I think actually I would be in a stronger position because he respects me. He really doesn't like me because I stood up to him. But I think that gives me a base of credibility to deal with him. So that's what I would have done.
Wow. So then Secretary Clinton echoes some advice both from Secretaries Powell and Rice, specifically strength, respect, a long-term strategy, persistence. These are all crucial for success in negotiating with Vladimir Putin. Clinton had to seek experiences that she thought might trigger an emotional response in Vladimir Putin and perhaps forge something of a connection. So she recounted her very moving visit to the St. Petersburg Memorial. And that triggered Putin to describe this extraordinary story of the time before he was born and what evidently shaped much of his psyche. It's unclear if this story is actually true, if Putin thinks it's true, or if he simply wants people to believe that it's true, but it certainly conveys something useful about his psyche and his views of outsiders. Clinton found another in as well, and this had to do with Putin's focus on preserving large Siberian mammals, specifically the Siberian tiger.
Funniest meeting I ever had with him was probably in 2011, I'm not sure. It was before he came back as president.
Right.
So I went to his dacha outside of Moscow. And he did the whole routine and, insulting the United States, sending out the press. And then we started talking, and he does, he does that classic pose of aggression, his legs splayed and staring at you, it's whatever. And so we went on and on and on. And I'm thinking, what am I going to talk to this guy about? He is so totally resistant to any kind of serious conversation. And even in the meetings, the time he met with the president, it was all very pro forma, and he was quite distant. So I studied up on him, and I finally said to him, I said, I really want to compliment you, Mr. President, for what you've done to conserve some of Russia's great wildlife. like the tiger.
Yeah. Siberia.
The Siberian tiger. He just sits up. He sits up straight, and he goes, yes, and he starts talking to me about the Siberian tiger. And then he starts talking to me about some other wildlife that he is, determined to save. And then he says, come with me. And I mean, everybody in the room is like, what's going on? So we get up, and he marches out of the room, and he goes down the stairs, and, I'm following after him. And he goes into this office, and all of his bodyguards and security guys are sitting there, and they're so surprised to see him. They jump to their feet. And then he goes to a door in the wall, and they press the button, and the door opens. And then we're in this huge room that is his, inner sanctum. It's got a very long table. Then it has a desk at the end, and on the wall is this enormous map of Russia. And he takes me over to the map, and he starts telling me where the Siberian tigers are. And then he says, in a couple of weeks, I'm going up here, and he points to the very, very far north. He says, I'm going up here to help tag polar bears, because we're going to save polar bears, too. And it's, what's that? There's that island up there, St. Francis, or some big island. So I'm going up there, I'm going to tag polar bears. And he turns to me and he goes, would your husband like to come? I said, well, I don't know, Mr. President. I'll be sure to ask him. I'll come.
I was going to say, you didn't ask.
Okay, he did not ask me. I'll come. And actually, Bill entertained it for a very, short period of time. And so, he was something other than the wooden, surly, intimidating figure that he always expresses.
I would note that despite Putin's antipathy, the U.S. was able to get Russian cooperation in sanctions against Iran and the Iran nuclear deal, as well as the air corridor over Russia that avoided Pakistani airspace in resupplying U.S. troops in Afghanistan, and some help as well on the nuclear and other fronts. Hillary Clinton was followed by John Kerry as Secretary of State in the second Obama administration. Kerry had been a longtime U.S. Senator, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Democratic nominee for president in 2004, and finally, Secretary of State. He negotiated a great deal with Vladimir Putin as well, as we'll hear in this clip. Could we zero in, as we have with other secretaries of state who've personally negotiated extensively with Vladimir Putin? What would be your advice for most effectively dealing with him? And I'd love it if you could give an example or two.
I spent hours with President Putin. I think there is still a residual bitterness in Putin. Not just about the loss of the Soviet Union, which we all know he famously said was the greatest tragedy of the last century, but I think a bitterness that during the 90s, when they were really on their ass, flat on that, there was a sense of triumphalism here. And they didn't get some of the loans and money and efforts they needed. And as I said, everybody has their own politics and their own perceptions. Part of the art of diplomacy is understanding and defining the person you're talking to, their needs, their perceptions, their whatever it is, even if it's wrong. And it may be dead wrong. In some cases, I think he was dead wrong. But you got to deal with it, nevertheless. If that's where they're coming from, perception becomes reality. So you got to find a way to knock it down. Now, we spent a lot of hours talking together about these kinds of things and perceptions and nuances. And I got President Putin to cooperate with us on a bunch of things. I mean, he cooperated with us on the Iran nuclear agreement. We got him to help on the Paris Agreement. We got him to help on the ICAO agreement, on the Kigali agreement. I mean, those are four big trifecta of environmental agreements in 2016. On the airlines industry, on the Montreal Protocol, he lifted a 10-year objection to our creating the largest marine protected area in the world in the Ross Sea of Antarctica. I was chairman of the Arctic Council that particular period, and Russia has huge interests up there, but we got them to be reasonable in working with us on what the communique would be and how we were going to work together on defining some of the mineral rights and climate change and claims being made. By the way, we cooperated on getting the chemical weapons out of Syria.
Yeah.
That was huge. I mean, people forget. Never have weapons of mass destruction been taken out of a country during a conflict. So Putin agreed to let Lavrov work on that. Lavrov and I went to Geneva. We negotiated for 5 days. We agreed on a mechanism to get him out. We both chose the OPCW in order to help get him out. And guess what? A few months later, the OPCW won the Nobel Peace Prize. That's how important it was to get that stuff out of there. Russia cooperated on that. Putin, the KGB thing is deep, and his menacing and interference in our elections is totally unacceptable. Dangerous, I mean, beyond the words, but we have to try to be able to work with him in a way that really changes that dynamic. And I think it is changeable, but it requires a larger conversation and a willingness to try to create a roadmap of steps you might take, to build a different. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to be one big grand bargain, but you could begin to take some steps that change the dynamics. And the world needs us to change the dynamics.
From Kerry, we hear the importance of some timeless advice on negotiation. You really need to listen closely to your counterpart, and you need to take his perceptions on board. Right or wrong, those perceptions have a kind of reality in the negotiations. How do you plan to deal with them? Kerry's experience also underscores that cooperation between the United States and Russia is important and often possible. Kerry listed a number of areas in which the United States and Russia came to agreement. And in many of those areas, cooperation had been elusive for a long time. Kerry's experience underscores the importance of a longer-term approach. As big a deal as it was at the time, getting many of the chemical weapons out of Syria was hardly the end of that tragic story. And a long-term perspective and a longer-term strategy is critical for longer-term success in dealing with Vladimir Putin. Finally, we turn to Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State at the beginning of Donald Trump's administration. Tillerson's experience in negotiating with Vladimir Putin is different in a couple of key respects from that of the other Secretaries of State we've discussed. Specifically, Tillerson negotiated with Vladimir Putin as a private citizen, as a senior executive and later chairman and CEO of ExxonMobil. So not only was he dealing with Putin in a different capacity, but he dealt with him for a long time, as far back as 1999, when Putin first assumed office. So let's listen to Rex Tillerson about his advice and his experience in negotiating with Vladimir Putin, and see what that adds to the perspectives of the other four secretaries. And I wonder if you could reflect on some of your experiences in the Russian Federation, dealing both as a private business person and later as Secretary of State, the advice you would give to someone who is going to deal with Vladimir Putin.
Well, I do benefit from having had a very, very long association with Vladimir Putin. I first met him in 1999. So we met with him in Sakhalin Island. He was on his way to Japan for his first overseas trip as Prime Minister of Russia. And we sat across the table, about 6 of us, and he read a 45-minute speech to us. And then we had a bit of a dialogue, but it was a very, very stilted, stiff kind of a meeting. And my Russian advisor, I had a lady by the name of Anna Kuniansky, who is a Russian Jewish immigrant. And we left that meeting, and she said to me, she says, well, what did you think? And in all first encounters with people, you tend to really study their body language, their behavior. You're trying to get a first impression of them. And she said, well, what did you think? And I said, Anna, it was really strange. I said I'd watch him and I'd look in his eyes and it's like there was nobody there. You know, there's like these little shadowy figures behind the screen, but he wasn't really there. When she looked at me with this wry smile of hers and she said, "Now you understand the KGB." And she said, "He will be whatever he needs to be in any situation he finds himself." And he had never been in a situation like this with someone like you before. He didn't know what to be, so he chose to be nothing. Now, as we came to know one another quite well in many, many meetings in his home in Moscow, down in Sochi, on his yacht in the Black Sea, touring around, we became quite cordial. He had an insatiable appetite for information. But the one constant about him was he was going to be whatever he thought he needed to be, and the KGB part of him never left in the 19 years I've known him. He's extraordinarily intelligent, very strategic, works harder than any other world leader I know of in terms of knowing information, knowing details, knowing everything about everything. So that makes him a formidable person to talk to. What I learned about Putin, though, is he respects two things: strength on the other side of the table, and he respects people who deliver on what they say.
I'd note, by way of connecting with Vladimir Putin, Rex Tillerson, representing a major international oil company, was focused on an area that Putin really knows. His doctoral dissertation, I understand, was about the strategic role of the oil industry. So there was a natural connection in that regard. And of course, that was ExxonMobil's business. Second, as we've heard before, clear respect for toughness, directness, and strength. Third, Putin can be really opaque and hard to read. Conversations can be stilted, especially early on. But as he becomes more familiar with you, maybe they become less stilted and a little bit easier. I would also note, as a possible corrective to what we've recently heard about Putin being isolated and almost delusional about different things, that may be true. But Tillerson's experience was that Putin had an insatiable appetite for information, that he was really smart, a point echoed by a number of the other secretaries, and quite strategic. So it's important not to underestimate this man or assume that he really doesn't know what's going on as a function of his recent isolation and activities. That could well be the case, but it would be a dangerous assumption to make, especially for someone who can be as hard to read as Tillerson found him, especially early in their relationship. As Tillerson continued in his Secretary of State role, he had more to say about Vladimir Putin. Let's continue with that conversation.
I always told my people, with Putin and the Russians, under-promise and over-deliver, because I saw my competitors make the mistake of promising things and then not being delivering, and Putin ate them for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. He would annihilate you if you ever let him down. And that's still, I think, characteristic of him today. So in terms of negotiating with him, I was always able to be very transparent, very forthright, always respectful. And he came to understand that that was the way it was going to be with us. And we had a lot of success because he understood this is what was within parameters and this wasn't. And if he wanted this, he could go find another international company to do that deal with, and we'd still be fine. You know, that's okay. But we're happy to talk about the next opportunity. If he doesn't get respect, you're going to find it very difficult to negotiate with him. If he doesn't feel you respect him. He once shared a story with me on his yacht in the Black Sea. He got a little animated talking about America, and he made the comment to me. He said, "You know, the problem with you Americans is you think you won the Cold War, and you treat us like a banana republic. We're still a nuclear power. We could have fought that war, but we didn't." That made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, I want to tell you. And that tells you a little bit about his mindset. So he is still in search of respect, recognition for not just himself, but for the Russian Federation government, and he wants an acknowledgement of their role in the global order. And if you don't give it to him, he will start taking actions to prove to you they matter. And that's what we're seeing over the last decade, basically. He does not feel we have given him that recognition. As a negotiator, I always understood, make sure you acknowledge and respect them, their capabilities in the private sector. I always acknowledge their scientists. They have tremendous science capacity still, wonderful institutions. We always tried to work with their institutions. Acknowledge that Russia has something to contribute to the world, and it sets a very positive stage. Then, all right, well, let's figure out what we can do together. And then you can have a good, productive negotiation. You take a different path, it's going to be a rocky road.
I think Tillerson's emphasis on the importance that Putin places on respect and acknowledgement and recognition is really important. This is particularly difficult when your counterpart, such as Vladimir Putin, has carried out abominable activities. So how do you respect somebody like that? And I think the key is not to agree with him or respect his values or his actions, with which we've got profound disagreement and disgust often, but rather respect the importance of his role internationally and that of the Russian Federation. Those are key. So now let's see if we can pull together what we might have learned from the experiences of 5 former U.S. Secretaries of State negotiating with Vladimir Putin. I do want to place their advice in the context of the 3 dimensions of negotiation that I mentioned at the outset. First is the setup, the moves that you make away from the table to make sure that you've got the most promising possible situation. We did not talk about that. Second, the elements of a creative deal design, the substance of the possible agreement, and we didn't talk about that. And third, there are the tactics, the direct interpersonal dealing, the psychological interaction to be most effective at the table. Now, you can learn a great deal about the best tactical approach to someone like Putin from reading some of the excellent books and articles that have been written on the subject by knowledgeable analysts, and I commend them to you. But it is also really useful to directly query the experiences of those who've negotiated extensively with Vladimir Putin, and that's been our focus. Now, as we go from Colin Powell to Rex Tillerson, the United States is a different country. The world has changed, as has Russia. Putin himself has evolved and is in a different situation. Circumstances do differ, and we have to take those important differences into account. But he's the same person, with the same formative experiences and the same personality. Thus, the key elements of an effective negotiating approach will be similar. I would also underscore that the advice we got from the 5 former secretaries was general from their time in government and was not specific to Ukraine. Nevertheless, I would encapsulate its most important elements as follows. First, you need an up-to-date profile of Putin. Frequently cited characteristics include the deep KGB heritage, the tough guy, ruthless and proud, a nationalist to his core, very intelligent, hungry for information, strategic, and surprisingly adaptable if necessary, at least in an earlier time of U.S.-Russian relationships, and profoundly suspicious of enemies. Think back to the story that his father supposedly told him of his mother and the Nazis before he was even born. Second, recall how useful both Powell and Rice, for example, found conversations with members of his inner circle, at least once they'd tested the advice from these sources for its value. Who now influences Putin? Who advises him? To whom does he listen? And what direct or indirect links to these people can be forged? Moreover, there are numerous others who've quite recently negotiated with Putin. Recently, for example, Naftali Bennett and Emmanuel Macron. Third, the secretaries consistently urged consulting with those, such as current ambassadors, who directly know the situation on the ground in Moscow as well as Ukraine. Pick their brains, query their direct experiences to get a granular sense of what's actually going on. What should you expect and prepare to deal with during an actual negotiating session? First, expect a Russian counterpart who may well be surly, menacing, and opaque. Second, there will almost certainly be an obligatory and lengthy tirade on the sins of the West, especially of the United States. This is often followed by his take on the history of Russia and Ukraine, which actual historians find bogus, but which animates and informs his actions. Third, you should expect what Condoleezza Rice describes as, quote, odd facts, unquote, whether he actually believes them or cynically uses them to knock you off base psychologically. Decide whether you're going to ignore them, contest them, or otherwise how to handle them. What should be the key elements of your approach? First, it is hard to overestimate the centrality of Putin's feeling respected by his counterpart, having his and Russia's key role in the world acknowledged, along with Russia's many genuine accomplishments. This is a man whose bluster and brutality may conceal a deep sense of insecurity, even inferiority. It can be nearly impossible to show respect for a man whose actions you find despicable, but acknowledgement of his and Russia's role and importance in the world can be valuable toward achieving your goals in a negotiation. Second, the former secretaries found it useful to seek commonality and connection to Putin. Colin Powell had an intelligence and military link that tied directly to Putin's experience. Condoleezza Rice, a scholar of the Soviet Union, then Russia, had a knowledge of Russian. Can you find meaningful experiences to unlock a more genuine reaction, as Hillary Clinton was able to unearth, despite Putin's antipathy toward her? Discussing the St. Petersburg Memorial and the endangered Siberian tiger, these opened up another side of Putin, not necessarily friendly, but one that was more amenable to doing business. And Rex Tillerson, in his role at ExxonMobil, found a natural link via the oil industry. You should seek to find or create similar sources of commonality and connections. Third, you need to show strength. Exploit whatever credibility you've earned by your actions, be transparent, be direct, and stick to your guns. Fourth, however you handle a single negotiating session, you need to be doggedly persistent. You're unlikely to get a result in a short meeting, or even 2 or 3 meetings, but it's essential to have a longer-term negotiating strategy within which these tactical and psychological insights can be helpful. And if and when you do get a deal, you need to deliver as well as build in enforcement provisions. In the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, the United States, Russia, and Britain committed, quote, to respect the independence and sovereignty in the existing borders of Ukraine, unquote, and, quote, to refrain from the threat or use of force, unquote, against the country. But this consideration moves beyond tactics to the right deal design for implementation, enforcement, and sustainability. I would note that these questions and insights with respect to Vladimir Putin are but a fraction of what we covered in the American Secretaries of State project. Of course, we talked about dealing with the Soviet Union, Russia, and Eastern Europe, but also Western Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, with a particular focus on China. I hope this has been useful as a tactical guide to dealing with Vladimir Putin once you've put the most promising setup in place and have a promising deal design that will induce the yes that you seek.
In closing, let me thank you for participating in this journey with us. I'd like to acknowledge 2 important points. First, obviously, this tape has not at all dealt with the difficult question of whether, in fact, there is a deal that might end the war between Russia and the Ukraine. We've not explored the critical questions of what the underlying interests of Putin and Russia are, or what the underlying interests of Ukraine and Zelensky are. Second, an equally important point is, although many may wish it weren't so, we're likely to have to deal with Putin for many months and years to come. In all probability, this will not be the last time that diplomats and others are going to have to decide whether to negotiate with Putin and how to negotiate with Putin. Regrettably, he's likely to be around for a considerable period of time.